chapter 13, verse 1. John says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his head the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as of the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. And I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints, and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. If any man have an ear, let him hear. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with a sword must be killed with a sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints." During World War II, Allied forces, and America in particular, made their way through many of the remote islands in the South Pacific. For the most part, Americans used these islands as temporary landing strips and supply depots. They would, of course, come into an island, they would erect a temporary landing strip, they would build these warehouses that they could store supplies for the war effort. However, one of the unintended consequences was that for the first time, some of the Aboriginal people on these islands were being exposed to modern civilization. And it made a radical impression upon these Aboriginal natives. For instance, they were seeing things that none of them had ever dreamed possible. Things like Zippo lighters, out of which fire would come instantly. Big machines that could push down trees and push the forest back. Jeeps that would run back and forth across their islands. Refrigerators that could keep food cold. Radios with human voices that were coming out of those squawk boxes. Tents you could put up that would keep rain off of you, and power tools that would help you put buildings together, and nuts and bolts that they had never seen before, and cans and jars in which food was being stored in. The list just goes on, and you can imagine the kind of impression that would leave on these island people who had never seen any of these kind of wonderful marvels of modern technology. But folks, that is why these Aboriginal island people concluded that these Americans must be gods. In fact, we have a name that we give to these people. I've probably talked about them before, but they were called the cargo cults. That's what we call them. Even to this day, they exist in the South Island Pacifics. They are the cargo cults. And the reason why is because after seeing these modern miracles, so to speak, and after World War II and after the Americans pulled out, what these Aboriginal island people did was start building shrines to the cargo gods. And they made perfect replicas of things like airplanes and airplane hangars and warehouses and things of that nature, and they would worship them, asking the cargo gods to bring the cargo back. And so, for instance, when they would see a plane fly over, they would pray to the cargo gods. And the fact is that some of them even personified all Americans into one deity that they called Tom Navy. And they would worship things like Zippo lighters and cameras and eyeglasses and ballpoint pens. In fact, when missionaries began making their way after World War II into these islands, these Aboriginal island people thought it was the second coming of the cargo gods. And so they received the missionaries with open arms. Now, of course, we sit here in modern America and kind of smirk at a story like that. Because in our eyes, it seems ludicrous that a bunch of people would turn Americans into gods. But folks, can you imagine that same spirit leaving the confines of the South Pacific Islands and sweeping over the entire world? Could you imagine that people of all nations and families and language literally following in the footsteps, in a sense, of the cargo cults and actually worshiping a man? Well, what we have this morning in Revelation 13 is a passage that describes that is exactly what will happen one day. that there is going to come a day when the entire world will worship a man. And this morning what we are going to investigate is what Revelation 13 and 2 Thessalonians 2 has to teach about that occasion. And so I have entitled this message, The World's Worship of the Beast. Now, I told you several weeks ago that my intention was to preach last week's message and this week's message back to back, because there were a lot of details that go together in those two messages. And I kept telling you last week not to get so concerned about the details. I just wanted you to get the overall picture of the identity of the beast that we were reading about in Revelation 13. I hope we did that. I trust we did that. But in case I didn't quite succeed, let me remind you of what we saw. Because in Revelation 13, for the first time in this book, we are identifying a figure known as the beast. And the question was, who is this beast? What is his identity? And we saw two main answers that comes out of the Bible and out of the book of Revelation. For instance, very clearly, this beast will be an individual figure that will come at the end of time. He will be a governor, a dictator, a king, if you will, whatever word you want to use, over a world government. The Bible doesn't always use the word beast to identify him. We saw last week there are several terms. Terms like the prince that should come, Daniel 9. Terms like the man of lawlessness, 2 Thessalonians, or the son of perdition. Terms like the Antichrist, 1 John chapter 2. But the fact of the matter is, it's very clear, and we'll see it again this morning, that this coming beast will be an individual who will arise as the ruler of this world. But secondly, I also pointed out to you that this coming beast was more than just an individual, because this beast is also identified as a succession of human kingdoms that have come and have gone. That's why when we read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 13, we have all these convoluted details of all these different descriptions of horns and heads and this different weird kind of body coming up out of the sea. You say, why do we have that? Because, folks, this beast is more than just an individual figure. There is more to this thing. There is successions of kingdoms that have come and gone that feed in to this last time beast that will arise over the world system. And so, folks, this morning what I want to talk about to begin with is a little more of the details of this historic beast. Before we actually get to the individual beast, at the end of verse 2 and the beginning of verse 3, we have a background here that I think we need to spend a little more time with, understanding some of the details. Why is this beast described with such a convoluted detail? Why is it that God gives us this information? Because he wants us to appreciate, folks, in modern America and modern man probably do not appreciate this as much as more ancient people had, but he wants us to appreciate that what is happening today is not some kind of modern marvel and a unique event. That what is happening today has been built on the succession of centuries and kingdoms that have come before. Again, I think we miss that point. We forget that point as Christians. But the fact of the matter is, folks, what will take place in the future is nothing new at all. It is rooted and it grows out of ancient civilizations and kings that have come before. And one of the main points of Revelation 13, 1 and 2 is that you need to understand that. You cannot divorce the coming individual beast in this coming world system from what has happened in ancient history. It's all tied together. In fact, to give you the analogy that God gave Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 2, I want you to again think of that great dream of a statue. Remember that statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about? It was a massive statue, and it had all these different metals. The head was gold, the chest and arms were silver, the legs and belly and were bronze, and so forth. And what we discovered is that each one of those metals represented different kingdoms and different characteristics, but folks, we often forget it's one statue. Monolithic statue, unified together, it's one thing. Okay, that's what we have here. We have one beast, but a lot of different characteristics that feed into the beast as well. Now, what is the background for this coming beast who will rule the world? Well, again, verses 1 and 2, John says this. He says, I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea. Now, that's what I want you to do for just a moment. Can you pretend you're standing beside John? Here you are on the seashore. You're looking out over the ocean, and as you're looking out of the ocean, you notice there's a disturbance out into the sea. Okay, that's what John sees. And out of the ocean comes something. Say, what happens? What comes up? Verse 1 again. He sees 7 heads, 10 horns, and on the horns are 10 crowns. In other words, you should think of it this way. Let's turn that around. Out of the ocean comes up these crowns that you're seeing. Then you see 10 horns that are on the crowns come up out of the sea. And because of Revelation 17, we know that those 10 horns are on the head of the seventh head of this beast. But these 7 heads come up next out of the ocean. That's what you're seeing. And then in verse 2, as the thing keeps coming up out of the ocean, you're noticing the body, which has the body of a leopard, it has the feet of a bear, and it has the mouth of a lion. Okay, a strange-looking creature coming up out of the ocean, but that's what John sees. And the question is, what do all these things mean? And so I want to spend some time with that this morning as we begin. What do all these things mean? Details here. I'll trust you follow this. I trust I can convey this in a way that makes sense, all right? Now, in order to understand what this means from the book of Revelation, I do want to point you back to chapter 17. Because in chapter 17, we are giving more details and more information about these images. Chapter 13 does not define them for us. Chapter 17 does. So turn over to chapter 17. In verse 12, we are explained to us what the 10 horns is. It says in chapter 17 of verse 12 that the 10 horns that break the surface of the water are 10 kings. And it tells us that the 10 kings have not received their kingdoms yet. But it explains that when this beast arises, these 10 kings will apparently serve in their kingdoms 1 hour with the beast. Now what that tells me is this, folks, is those 10 kings have not come on the scene yet. If you ask me who are they, I do not know. No idea. But all we know is that one day they will serve as kings over this world with the beast, and it says for 1 hour, a short period of time. You say, well, do we know any more about them? We do a little bit. The book of Daniel tells us a little more about them, and one day when we get to chapter 17, we'll probably go there, but I'm just going to fill in the story a little bit. It appears that these 10 kings will be 10 kind of rulers. You might want to call them cabinet members, if you will, but 10 potentates, if you will, that will rule over 10 regions of the world and will help the beast rule over this world. That's why I kind of think of them as the cabinet members for the beast, this one world king, okay? But there are going to be 10 that will serve along with him, that will be part of his government. And I'm just putting that out there because the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation speaks of this. 10 coming rulers. Now, that's pretty much all we know about these 10 kings. However, we do know this as well. Those 10 horns do sit upon 7 heads. And again, I want to spend some time with this one because it's the 7 heads that explains, folks, that this succession of kingdoms, this beast is a succession of kingdoms. So I want to spend some time with these 7 heads because the fact of the matter is, chapter 17 gives us a little more detail about these 7 heads. Say, what do we know about these 7 heads? Well, it says in verse 10 that they are 7 mountains connected to 7 more kings, which probably means that the mountains are kingdoms over which the 7 specific kings rule. Now, the question is, who are the 7 kings? And the reason that's the question is because verse 10 explains that 5 of these kings have already come and gone. They have fallen. One king was existing when John wrote the book of Revelation, and one king is yet to come. So, we got 7 kings, and 5 of them have already taken place. One had existed when John writes the book of Revelation. One will come in the future. And everybody debates, though, who are these kings? So, what do you think? Who do you think the kings are? Well, let's start with the king that we can be pretty certain about. Let's start with the one that lived when John was writing this book. Say, who was that? Well, if we're right, John wrote this book in the mid to early AD 90s. This is probably a Roman emperor named Domitian. Y'all have all heard his name before. He was not a nice man. But his name was Domitian. He persecuted the church. And he ruled from AD 81 to AD 96. That's probably the king that was ruling that's being referenced here when John wrote this book. Which means the mountain, the kingdom that Domitian represents would be what kingdom? The Roman Empire. It has to be the Roman Empire. That's the one that existed during the first century when John wrote this book. So, that's probably the first king. But the question is, who are the 5 other kings that had already come and gone? There's some debate about this. I'm just pulling through this because you probably have some study notes in your Bible. You might come across this. Let me just run through this real briefly. There are some who think that these 5 kings may have been 5 previous Roman emperors before Domitian. And I'll tell you why. Because in chapter 17, it tells us that there are 7 mountains upon which these kings rule. And everybody has looked at that and said, well, you know what? The city of Rome has historically been called the city of 7 hills, right? Now, some of you have heard this. You know your ancient history. Rome is built upon 7 hills. And people said, well, see, this is all talking about the Roman Empire. So these 5 kings that have come and gone must also be Roman kings. The problem with it is that before Domitian, there had been 11 Roman emperors. So that doesn't quite work. 4 of those emperors came very quickly and left the scene. So people say, well, we can get rid of them. But that still leaves you, I think, 8 if my math's right or something like that. That's still problematic. And then on top of that, folks, the 7 mountains seem to be identified as separate kingdoms with separate kings. And I would encourage you perhaps to think of it that way, although I might be mistaken. I would say that the 7 kingdoms point us to the direction of separate individual empires, actual kingdoms that came. Now, if we take it that way, are there 5 different kingdoms that came before Rome that had already fallen, and I'm going to throw this in here, that had a lot to do with the nation of Israel? Because remember what's happening in the context, the dragon of chapter 12 is going to attack the nation of Israel. And the implication is he's going to use this beast in chapter 13 to target the nation of Israel. So are there 5 kings that are part of this beast that came before the Roman Empire that had something to do with governing and targeting the nation of Israel? What do you think? You still following? I hadn't lost you yet. Some of you look at me like, history lesson, didn't come here for that this morning. No, this is good stuff. Are there 5 kingdoms that came before? Well, let's start counting back. Who was before Rome? Who ruled before Rome? All right, Daniel's going to say Greece. And who was the main king of Greece that we all know and you're familiar with? Alexander the Great. He was the king that established the Grecian Empire, basically made it as grand as it was. And the fact of the matter is, in Daniel 11, there's a lot of information about the battles that went over the nation of Israel between the kingdom of Greece and the different factions of Greece. So yes, we have a kingdom called Greece. Who came before Greece? Yeah, the Persian Empire came before Greece. Who was the main king that had a lot to do with Israel? It was a king named Cyrus. He's the one that issued the decree for Israel to go back to the land of the land of Israel, and rebuild their nation, rebuild their city, rebuild their temple. So you've got the Persian Empire. Is there another kingdom that had something to do with Israel before Persia? The Babylonian Empire, and the big name we know there is Nebuchadnezzar. And he's the one responsible for ransacking Israel. He's the one that destroyed the temple. Yep, Babylon's there. So we've got 3 kingdoms. Is there a kingdom before that? No, we went too far back. Assyria is the kingdom before that. What did they do? Well, they ransacked the northern tribes. They carried them into captivity. You say, what king is responsible for that? Well, we're not quite sure. There was Shalmaneser V or Sargon II who was involved in that episode of carrying them into captivity. So we got the Assyrian kingdom, and then we got one last kingdom that has oppressed Israel. Which one was that? Your time, Daniel. It was the nation of Egypt. You say, well, what king was involved with that one? I don't know. There was obviously different pharaohs that suppressed Israel. We're not quite sure what king that might have been. But it's my belief, and again, I may be wrong on this. This is my speculation, that the 5 kings that had come with the 5 kingdoms were these 5 nations. You have Egypt, then Assyria, then Babylon, then Persia, then Greece, and then, of course, Rome that existed during John's day. That would fit pretty nicely. I'm just suggesting that to you. If you ever study this passage, that's a suggestion here. But folks, if you go back to Revelation 13, verses 1 through 2, it's clear that even though these kingdoms had fallen, and even though one existed in God's day, and even though there's one coming, what we discover is there's a unity to these kingdoms. Say, why do you say that? Because into verse 1 again, it says this, and upon his heads, the heads of this beast, the name of blasphemy. Every one of them has been characterized by something. I don't care if it's Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, everyone's been characterized by something. Verse 1 tells us it's blasphemy. And folks, you can read your Old Testament and you can see that. In fact, there are whole chapters of your Old Testament who these nations made it their mission to battle God. And there's huge debates in your Old Testament about who is the true God. Is it the gods of Egypt? Is it the gods of Assyria? Is it the gods of Babylon? And they will debate this and they will talk about this. Who is the true God? Well, folks, every kingdom that has come, that has attacked Israel, that has governed Israel, that has been the issue. They have blasphemed God. They said, there is no God in Israel. Our gods are the true God. So they are unified in that characteristic. But folks, they're unified in something else. Go ahead and look at verse 2. They are unified in the fact that the last coming great governmental beast will be a compilation of all the fierceness and ferocities of the ones that came before. That's what it says. Look at it. And the beast which I saw was likened to a leopard, and its feet was the feet of a bear, and the mouth of a lion. Say, what's all that about? Well, again, I'm not going to go in too much detail, but those animals describe different nations. You can read about it in Daniel chapter 7, and they are used to describe the ferocity of certain kingdoms. And what it's telling you is that when this final national global beast arises on the scene, it's going to incorporate all the fierceness and all the ferocities of all the kingdoms that have come before into this final beast. You say, well, what's the point? The point's basically this. Here's what we have. We have coming one day 10 kings. Revelation 17 says they will rule with a beast. But they do not spring up in a vacuum all by themselves. Their roots go deep down into human civilization and governments. And when they will rule with the most fearsome, ferocious characteristics that made up all the other kingdoms that came before them. This end times beast, this one world government, will be the most lethal, powerful, speedy government that has ever existed. And here's why. Verse 2, end of the verse. It says, and the dragon, that is Satan, gave him his power and his seat and his great authority. Now that could be a reference to the single beast that will arise to be the king over this one world government. Or it may be a reference, and probably both, to the fact that this one world government has received its power and its position from the dragon. And folks, I just want to pause and remind you of the fact that the dragon who is in this passage is going to use the beast to target the nation of Israel. And he's the one that's being credited in this passage with being the power behind the human governments and kingdoms. I'm not sure how many times God's people has appreciated that, but I just want you to appreciate this morning that much of what happens in the realm of human governments actually is at work behind the scenes, a dragon who's at work. You say, no, that can't be the case. No, it can be. In fact, both Satan and the Bible support that conclusion. For instance, do you remember the occasion when Satan tempted Jesus in the wilderness in Luke chapter 4? Remember that? On one occasion when he came to tempt Jesus, he took Jesus up on a high mountain, and the text says he showed Jesus all the kingdoms of the world at one time. Clearly something supernatural taking place there. I don't know if he showed Jesus all the ancient kingdoms that had already come. Maybe he showed Jesus the current kingdoms that were in existence. The Roman Empire, the Egyptian Empire, maybe the Eastern kingdoms, who knows? But he shows him all the kingdoms of the world at one time. And he tells Jesus, if you will bow down and worship me, which is what Satan has always wanted, Jesus to worship him. If you will do that, I will give you all the kingdoms of the world. And then he adds, and I have the authority to do that. And folks, Jesus never disputed that. He never said, hang on, Satan, hang on. That's wrong. Jesus never disputed that Satan has the authority to give kingdoms to certain individuals. In fact, 2 Corinthians chapter 4 tells us that he is the God of this world. And I think Christians need to recognize that much of what happens behind the scenes of human governments goes far beyond a bunch of men and women sitting in rooms, writing, executing, and adjudicating laws. There is a satanic influence behind human governments. You say, well, does that mean that God's not in control? Yes, God's still in control. God's still the one who turns the hearts of the king. God still allows who gets set up and who's not. But apparently God does use Satan in that endeavor as he is trying to outmaneuver God in the war of the ages. Well, Revelation 13:2 says that this historical beast that has come from the time of Babylon, maybe from the time of Egypt, will be given his power. That is his military might. Will be given his seat. That means his specific place of authority within the world affairs and government, and his authority, which means the extent of his dominion and rule. The dragon is energizing all that. He is giving that to this beast. So the last human government will be established upon the shoulders of all that has come before, and they will be positioned there by Satan. And remember, once again, according to Revelation 12, the design by Satan will be for the annihilation of the nation of Israel. So the question I'm going to ask now is this, turning a corner on the message. How in the world will the world allow that to take place? Because I'm going to tell you right now that even though there is a rise of an anti-Semitic spirit, and this is true, there's still a lot of sympathy for the nation of Israel. In fact, this past week, I came across a video, really stumbled across it. I'm not sure why it was recommended to me, but it was recommended to me on YouTube about how Germans teach World War II. That's always fascinated me. I thought, well, I want to listen to this. It was about a 10 or 11-minute video, if I recall, and the guy was explaining how those in Germany teach the history of World War II to their people. And basically, one of the conclusions that came out of that video was one of the lessons the Germans learn is they bear a sacred duty never to allow the atrocities of Nazi Germany to be repeated again. But what really interests me were the comments under the videos, if you're on YouTube and you know there's comments sometimes, of the people who had gone through the German high school system, and they agreed with what this guy was saying. They said, this guy's got it exactly right. I went through the school system. This is what they tell us. They teach us that we bear a responsibility never to allow the concentration camps and the exterminations and the lust of war to ever happen again. However, folks, what I think is interesting, I'm just putting this out here, is the fact that Germany is today the cornerstone of the European Union, which many people believe will be the foundation of that revived Roman Empire and the organizing principle of this beast that will one day come about. So again, my question is this: if that's the case, how in the world could the world allow a worldwide government targeting the nation of Israel? That seems absolutely almost preposterous to me based on current events and recent history and what these people are saying about how they can never allow this to happen again. Well, folks, the answer to that is in verses 3 and 4. So let's turn our attention now to the individual beasts that will rule this government. Look at it, verse 3. John writes, and I saw what? One of his heads. Now we're not talking about this big succession of kingdoms. We're talking about one head, one king, one ruler. Which head? Clearly the seventh head, right? The one who hasn't come yet. The seventh head, he sees this head, but notice what happens to this individual. It says, as it were wounded to death. Literally in the Greek language, the word wounded to death means slaughtered to death. It's the same word used in Revelation 5 of Jesus, who it said was the lamb that was slain or slaughtered to death. Say, what does this mean? This means, folks, that when this king arises to rule over this historical governing beast, that he will be violently killed. In fact, we know that's the case because verse 14 of this same chapter tells us he's killed with a sword. He is going to be assassinated, is what will take place. Now, folks, of course, in our nation today, we have had leaders who have been assassinated. Back in 1981, Ronald Reagan was shot. He did not die. We have to go back to 1963 when President Kennedy was assassinated by a sharpshooter's bullet. But in both episodes, those who were alive then can remember the sense of disbelief, the sense of grief, the sense of really just unbelief that our leader had been attacked, had been shot, and in one case, of course, with Kennedy, had been killed. But folks, can you imagine what it will be like when the leader of this one world government is attacked and killed? I mean, we're talking about, I know you hear the phrase, a new world order. That's what it will be. We're talking about something that had never existed as far as they can determine in human history. A world government dominating all aspects of the world. There are 10 kings ruling over the 10 regions of the world. However, that's going to be divided up one day. And there will be one man who is arisen above the rest. It's a government the likes no one had ever even hardly imagined in human history. And now the leader of this government is dead by violent assassination. You can imagine the shock and the disbelief that will reign over the entire world. But folks, verse 3 tells us that the shock and the disbelief will be turned into amazement. Because, look at it again, verse 3. It says, his deadly wound is healed. What would you call that? Here's a guy who's been killed with a sword, maybe stabbed in the head, it might imply, but now the wound's healed. Okay, he has been resurrected. He's now alive again. In fact, this is why verse 3 says, and all the world wondered after the beast. That word wondered has the idea that these are people who can't explain what they've seen, which is saying something, right? Because these guys have seen a lot. The first 3.5 years of the tribulation, they have seen unimaginable suffering. They have seen famine. They have seen demonic invasion. They have seen months long of agony and pain. And yet this is the thing that causes the world to just stand back in wonder and awe because they cannot explain this. Here's someone they watched die. They know he was stabbed with a sword, and yet his wound has healed, and now he's alive again. And folks, these are people now who's going to do the unimaginable. Look at verse 4. Here's the conclusion. It says, first of all, they worshiped the dragon which gave power unto the beast. I don't even know what that means. Honestly, I cannot explain that to you. I'm not sure exactly how that's going to look, what that's going to look like, but apparently Satan will be worshipped, maybe behind the scenes implicitly. But the text goes on and says this, and they worshiped the beast, saying, and here's the two questions they ask, who is like unto the beast, and who is able to make war with him? Good questions. I understand those questions. From a human perspective, have you ever seen anybody die and rise again? How many of you say, yep, I know somebody like that? Nobody has ever seen that. And folks, if you had somebody like that, the next question would be, who in the world can make war with them? Because, I mean, you just kill the guy, he's going to come back again. Kill him again, I guess he'll come back again. He's going to outlive you, I guess. Who really can make war with somebody like that? And folks, what they are going to do is they are going to worship, a worldwide expression of worship. You say, well, how will this play out? I mean, that almost seems almost completely unimaginable. That a world could get to the place where they are literally apparently falling down and extolling one man as God. How do we get there? Well, let's turn back for just a moment to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 that we read this morning. Because 2 Thessalonians 2 gives us a dimension of this that we need to recognize, and it answers, in a sense, a question that we might have of that passage. Again, I want to remind you that in this chapter, Paul is explaining to the local church that the day of the Lord, the tribulation, had not arrived yet. They had people coming into their church and their community saying, no, it's the tribulation that's here. And Paul says, no, don't get it wrong. Don't be deceived. We're not here yet in the tribulation. And then Paul gives some identifying characteristics that you would know for sure you were in the tribulation if they were to come to pass. You say, what kind of things? Look at verse 3. Paul says this, the day of the Lord will not come except there come a falling away first. So what does that mean? Well, literally in the Greek, it's there comes the apostasy. The apostasy. Apparently Paul says there's coming a day where something's going to be called the apostasy. You say, what's an apostasy? Well, in Christian circles, an apostasy is when a person professes to know Jesus, and there comes a point in their life they say, you know what? That was all a sham. That was all a game. I'm turning my back on Jesus. That was just a joke in my mind or whatever it was, and I no longer want to have anything to do with Jesus. That would be apostasy. But Paul says there's coming a day when the whole world is going to experience the apostasy. And there's some interpreters who interpret that as a Christian apostasy. I personally feel like, and this is my own personal interpretation, this is a worldwide apostasy. This is a world that completely turns its backs on all their gods. Now, what would it take to get a Muslim and a Buddhist and a Catholic and a Shintoist to just turn their backs completely on their gods. Because verse 4 seems to imply that this man of sin, this lawless person, will oppose and exalt himself above all that's called God or is worshipped. So that as he sits in the temple of God, he shows himself that he's God, and something is going to convince the world that that's true. So what would it take, folks, to get a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Catholic, a Mormon, whatever it is, to turn their backs on their gods and worship this man? Because I'm telling you, that seems almost ludicrous. I mean, there have been wars fought in the name of religions over the centuries because people were fighting for their gods. They have been at each other's throat over the centuries because of their religions. What is going to get all these people to agree that this man now sitting in that temple in Jerusalem really is God? What do you think? Well, verse 9 is one answer to that. Look down at verse 9. It says in verse 9 that Satan will be at work with all power, signs, and lying wonders. Those three words, power, signs, and wonders, are the three Greek New Testament words for miracles. Satan will be doing miracles around this man. Say, what miracles? Don't know for sure, but he will be able to do miracles through Satan's power. That should not surprise us. Even the Egyptian magicians could do miracles through Satan's power to a degree. However, we also have this verse 11. Look there at 2 Thessalonians 2:11. It says, "For this cause God shall send them a strong delusion, that they should believe a lie." Literally in the Greek, it's definite. The lie. What would be the lie that the world believes? That this man's God. But this verse says God's going to send them a strong delusion. How many of you have ever read that and really bothered you? Nobody's ever been bothered by that? That's always bothered me. What do you mean God is going to send the world a strong delusion so they believe the lie that this man's God? Well, folks, I think it's Revelation 13 that answers the question. Apparently this king, the seventh head that will arise, he's going to die, he's going to rise again. Who raises him from the dead? Well, who's the person in Scripture who says he's the resurrection and the life? Who's the person that says he has life within himself? It is not Satan. Satan does not have the ability to raise people from the dead. Jesus is the only one who's the resurrection and the life. And I firmly believe that what Revelation 13 compared with this passage is teaching us is that it will be Jesus who raises this man from the dead. And that should not surprise us, folks, because one day Jesus will raise everyone from the dead, saint and sinner alike. So that should not be a surprise to us. And at this point in human history, Jesus is the one who's going to raise this man from the dead. And folks, that is going to cause a response from the world who is going to embrace this person as God. And I think you would agree that seeing someone rise from the dead would be a powerful incentive to embrace him as God. In fact, do you remember what doubting Thomas did when he saw Jesus rise from the dead? He said, I want to see his hands, I want to see his side. And when Thomas had the opportunity to see this Jesus that rose from the dead, what did Thomas do? He fell down at Jesus' feet and said, "My Lord and my God." And the fact is that the gospel message is predicated on the fact that people recognize Jesus' lordship and deity by virtue of his resurrection. The only problem is that this entire world has rejected Jesus as the one who died and rose again. In fact, this past week, once again, I was listening to a guy on YouTube. Great place to listen to things, right? I was listening to this guy on YouTube. And here he is. He is a former professing Christian. He has now been turned into a comedian. And now he goes around, and part of his act is to mock anything to do with Jesus. And he was comparing Jesus to the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. And to him, it's a big joke that there are Christians who for centuries believe that a man actually died for them and rose out of the grave. And the whole crowd he was talking to is clapping and they're cheering as this man mocked any idea of Jesus' resurrection. Well, folks, what happens, however, if a man truly rises from the dead in front of the eyes of the whole world? Well, they're going to do what Thomas did. They're going to fall down in front of this man and they're going to worship this man as God. Revelation 13 says that they will do, and it will no longer be laughing and mocking. They're going to fall on their face as if this man is indeed God. And folks, Jesus says in Matthew 24 that the deception will be so powerful. It will be so powerful and so compelling with signs and wonders that if it were possible, even the elect would be deceived by this. I don't know what that even feels like. To be able to look at somebody who's going to rise from the dead and feel like, maybe this person is God. But it could potentially shake the faith of somebody who was a genuine Christian. That's what Jesus implies. That's how powerful it will be. You say, well, what will be the thing that will not cause Christians to be deceived? I think our text in Revelation 13 explains that. Go back there to Revelation 13. Here's what it says. It says in verse 5, "And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months." That's the last half of the tribulation. "And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven." Folks, what's the defining characteristic of this individual? 3 times it's mentioned in those 2 verses. He will blaspheme. He will blaspheme, and he will blaspheme, and he will blaspheme. And by the way, verse 1 of chapter 13 says that's what has characterized the beast through all the centuries. It has been a blasphemous beast. Say, what does it mean to blaspheme? Well, some people think blasphemy is some guy out there that's an atheist shaking his fist in God's face, daring God to strike him down if he truly exists. Well, yes, that would be blasphemous. I would agree with that. But I'm telling you right now, folks, blasphemy is much more insidious and much more subtle than that. The word blasphemy just means to simply speak irreverently about God or sacred things. Again, it's what I heard this past week from that comedian as he stood in front of that audience and he made fun of Jesus' virgin conception and birth. He made fun of Jesus' walking on the water, of his miracle of feeding all those multitudes, and of his death and resurrection. It's the kind of thing that practically goes on every night of the week on network television when you watch these sitcoms and they make jokes about God. And they are worshiping, or somebody stands up and desires to be worshiped as God. Folks, we live in a world today that's filled with blasphemous. They're not in a rage. They're not out there somehow attacking viciously the idea of God, although there are some rabid atheists who do. But by and large, blasphemy comes into this popular culture in songs and in jokes and in sitcoms and in movies and in quotes that's designed to denigrate anything to do with God, to keep people from being serious about the God of the Bible. And folks, in the midst of this powerful deception, this man who calls himself God will be doing that. He will be making jokes. He will be making snide remarks. He will be blaspheming the God of the Bible. He will be blaspheming the God of Israel. He will be blaspheming the holy things, the sacred things, those who dwell in heaven. He will be blaspheming those things. And folks, you need to reckon with that, because I'm telling you right now, this world is being set up for that. You go out there and you look at pop culture and you see what they sing about, you see what they laugh about, you see what they joke about, you see what they talk about. It's all designed to get people not to take the God of heaven seriously. To think that this book is just an absolutely ancient, old-fashioned book. It's a joke. Nobody needs to pay attention to it anymore. That's blasphemy, folks. This world is being set up so that one day, when there is a beast that arises, and he is struck down and killed and rises again, he will claim to be God. And everybody will follow and bow and worship him. And he will cause everybody to think the God of this Bible is just a nutty old superstition. And it will be blasphemy. You say, well, what's the response I should have to this? Well, folks, I think very simply, I want to make this one application. I'm going to close. The application is this. Don't let those kind of comments slide. Don't let any kind of blasphemous comment slide. In fact, I told my wife recently, I heard a comment someone made. And it wasn't exactly blasphemous, but it kind of bordered on it. And I said, I probably should have said something about that. I probably should have spoke up and said, why did you say that? Have you really thought about what that means? Because you're basically denigrating the character of God by what you just said. And this person, I think, would have been shocked to really think of it that way. Well, folks, our God is a God that deserves all respect. He deserves all honor. He deserves all glory. And we live in a world where people are not taking him seriously. And verse 9 says this, "If any man have an ear, let him hear." If you're really paying attention to what he's saying, he's basically arguing that will be the spirit of the times. Well, folks, that's where we live today. That's where we live today. And there's coming a day when this world is going to fall down and worship a man as God. And what will take place one day is that this coming world ruler will be worshiped. But as God's people, we can have no part of that because we have a Savior. Yes, He did come into this world. He lived a perfect life. He died on the cross for our sins. And He rose again, and He is at the right hand of the Father. And as much as Satan wants to deceive this world that there is another God and another Christ, the fact of the matter is, Scripture has already warned us not to be sucked into that, but has warned us that when that day comes, He will be blasphemous. So this morning, folks, let us be fervent in our upholding of the honor of Jesus Christ. And let us with passion go into this world and warn people that this day is coming, a day of deception, a day that's already being formed up. And let us with passion tell people about the true Messiah. His name's Jesus. Let's bow in prayer.